We're going to make a start here. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar presented by UFI. My name is Mark Berthelemy, and I'm a learning solutions architect, consultant, project manager, and product owner. Really, I do whatever is needed to help people communicate within a team working on learning technology projects. And so with me are my colleagues from UFI. We have Sarah Axon, Faye, I'm terrible with your name, I'm sorry, Faye Bagnovich and Manjinder Sangha. And they will be sitting in the background waiting to answer your questions. Now, if you have technical issues, please post your questions into the question box. Some people are already doing that. And the team will try and answer those questions. So just give me a second while I respond to someone. Hang on, to check audio. Yeah, sorry about that. There we go. So what we're going to be doing is thinking about how we move our training online quickly. I'm assuming most of you are trainers of some sort. We've got about 143 people in here at the moment, so I'm assuming most of you are in the training world of some sort. I'm going to be asking you a question in a moment about what sort of organization you're working in, just to give me a bit of a picture to help me tailor the webinar for you. But first of all, I would like to find out a little bit about where you are at the moment. So I'm just going to post a little poll up on screen. And that should now be appearing on your screen. And if you can select one of those options, and if none of them really work for you, then I'm terribly sorry about that. We only had 5 options that we could use. So just choose the best fit for you. This is a little bit of fun just to get us used to using the system and to start getting a feel for who is in the system. So I'm hoping that is working. Yes, it is working. The numbers are coming in rapidly. It seems like most of you, nearly half of you, are working in a living or in a dining room. And next after that is in a bedroom. And after that, we have kitchens and conservatories, and 3% are working in a cupboard. I do feel for you. These are strange times that we are working in, aren't they? So thank you. That's brilliant. I'll just leave that poll open for another few seconds while we get most of the people in. Yeah, the numbers aren't changing too much. It's still just under half working in your living and dining room. So thank you. That's brilliant. I'm just going to close that. And so back to, where's it gone? There we go, there we go, right. So it is just a reminder to ask questions in the questions box, and Sarah and the team will be keeping an eye on those questions. And as we go through, there'll be opportunities for Sarah and the team to raise those questions of me. We'll find a gap, and then we'll answer a few of the questions as we go along. You shouldn't be able to use your microphone, so don't worry about that. If you're thinking that you should be able to talk into it, don't worry. Everyone is muted in a webinar. That's just how these things work, I'm afraid. Okay, so moving on. So what we're going to be doing today is thinking about these things. So what are the main differences between face-to-face and online training? Thinking about some things to consider as we move online. Thinking about some pitfalls that we need to avoid, and most of these are based on my own experience. I've had enough time to fall into most of the pits that are available. Thinking about how we can get started for zero cost, and some useful places that you can go to for help. Now, thing to remember about this session, it's the second version of the first webinar. So we first ran it last Thursday, and we're running it again today, hopefully with some tweaks to make it work better. And then this Thursday is another webinar, and we'll explain to you what's happening about that webinar at the end of this session. And then the following Thursday, there's another webinar as well on different topics. So this one is very much an introduction, very generic webinar. It's designed to be that way. And the next few webinars are going to give some more detail. Now, as we work through this agenda, as such, as I said, I will be leaving space for questions. So please pop your questions into the question box so we can respond to some of those. And I'll be hopefully bringing out some of the things that we learned on the last webinar last Thursday, and hopefully addressing some of the questions that were also raised that we weren't able to address actually on that webinar. So even if you were here last week, hopefully there will be something new for you. So what are the main differences between face-to-face and online training? So for me, one of the biggest upsides is you're not limited by time or location. Face-to-face training is a really limiting experience if you think about the fact that you're restricting who you can work with and when you can work with them. And face-to-face training is also a very expensive experience if you consider the fact that you've got to get all those people all in the same place, all at the same time, and the knock-on impacts of getting everyone together at the same time. So you've got much more flexibility with online training. You've got much more a greater ability to reach more people. So we're going to think about what can you do to take advantage of these, and what are the things that you need to do to take advantage of them. So one of the things that I would say is online training is brilliant if you're going to be developing or delivering the same materials over and over again. There's no point in someone coming to a face-to-face session just to be a consumer of materials. So if you're just delivering materials, then you can create them once and deliver them multiple times without any extra effort. Now that's a great advantage. Obviously, there's the consideration that you've got to think about. Okay, sometimes you will tweak materials based on who the people are, who the audience is. So you've got to take that into account as well. But if you think about people that are training via YouTube, and we've seen it massively over the last week, but even before then, for years, people have been training over YouTube. They record it once and they deliver it multiple times to hundreds, thousands, if not millions of people. I'll just give you one example of that, which I've experienced personally. I had an issue with a headlamp bulb in a car. First time I couldn't work out how to change it, so I took it to Halfords. They changed it for me, and it cost me £5 to get them to change it. The second time it went, I worked out how to replace the bulb myself. I spent the next hour recording a quick video, putting that on YouTube, showing how to change it. And that video has had getting on for over 100,000 views. Is that 100,000? I can just double check while we're here. It was, no, I won't double check. I'll say many thousands of views and hundreds of positive comments about it. And you can go and find that video if you're interested. And you think the amount of money that's been saved just by me putting that video on, which took an hour of my time, and at £5 a pop, it saved massive amounts of money. So if you're doing that sort of thing where you can replicate what you're delivering over and over again, then put it online, do it once, and then it can go multiple times. So moving online obviously has some downsides. And one of the biggest ones is that things do take a lot longer to do. It's a new environment for lots of people. There are technical things to work out. There are social norms to work out. Things we do things in a slightly different way when we're working together online. You know, those of you who are new to using tools like Zoom and stuff over the last week, you've probably had to work out, how do we make this work? It's not like when you're in a room and everyone could talk at once, because you have to take turns, otherwise you won't hear people. You have to work out what are the signals that we're going to use to say how a meeting is going to proceed and things like that. So technology and social norms do take time to deal with. Things take longer, and that's just something you have to plan in to your training. You are also competing much more explicitly for people's attention. When people are in a face-to-face session, yes, they can daydream, yes, they can look at their phones, but it's a bit awkward sometimes to do that if you might get picked on. But when you're working online, you can't necessarily see what people are doing. You can't you can't address people that are losing interest. They might just go off and do something else, do their emails or whatever, as probably a lot of you are doing at the moment, I'm sure. And that's fine. Don't worry about that. It's much easier for people to just walk out and leave the room, in quotes, to disappear from your training or your program or whatever it is that you're doing with them. So what can we do to mitigate those things? Well, I'd say first thing is know your tools, know how the technology works, so you can then help other people know how the technology works. And secondly, give people time. And one of the big mistakes I made very, very early on in my career with online learning, this is 20 years ago, we had a teacher training program that we were running. It was entirely online. We were working with 30,000 teachers, and we tried to get them discussing straight away the deep issues that they were facing about using IT in their classrooms. And I would say very few, a tiny percentage of people actually took advantage of that discussion space, because it was completely new to most people. They hadn't got to grips with the technology, they hadn't got to grips with the social norms. What we should have done was take them on a step-by-step process. And there's a very useful guide written by a lady called Gilly Salmon, Gilly Salmon, as in fish, who was at the Open University, and she's a professor of educational technology at Leicester, I think now. And she wrote a book called E-Moderating, which has in it a 5-step guide. You can look at it, 5-stage guide for online learning. And you start off, if you miss out stages 1, 2, and 3 and try and go straight to stage 4, which is where you're discussing stuff, you will find you lose people. So if you start very slowly, start with stage 1, which is about getting used to the technology, getting used to how things work. Stage 2 is about sharing information, and it goes through step by step like that. Then you can start getting people, you can take people with you. So take your time over things. And the final thing to mitigate these downsides is try and make everything you do and say useful. So there's no room for any padding in when you're going online. You try and make everything you do useful. So I'm sure many of you you've looked for something on YouTube, and if the video looks like it's going on too long, the introduction's too long, whatever, you leave it, you go on to the next one. That's just how it works when you're online. People haven't got, they want to get to the useful stuff really quickly. So those are some things to mitigate that. So I'm wondering, how do you feel about this? Is this an opportunity, or is it a threat for you? And I'm going to ask another question of you, just to get a picture of where things are. So I've launched another poll. How are you feeling at the moment about working online? So this is really encouraging. This is very good. Okay, thank you. I'll just leave it another few seconds. Okay, brilliant. So 46% are enthused and raring to go. That's brilliant. But 32% are saying it'll be okay. That's great as well. There's the rest of you, 19% plus another couple of percent, are a bit worried about it or quite anxious. And that's fine as well. It's fine to be scared about this because this is new. This would be like someone who's never been to a conference before, walking into a conference room for the first time and not quite knowing how to walk up to people, how to talk to people, how things work, and that's fine. So hopefully this session will take you a little bit on that journey, give you some pointers to how things are going to work, and it will also give you some pointers to where to get help in the future. So that's really useful. Thank you very much. I'm going to close that poll now. So just moving on, some things that we might need to consider. And I've got 6 things based on my experience, but I'm sure there are many others, and I know there are many others. These are just the ones that came to the top of my head when I was preparing this. And in your feedback for this session, it would be great if you have other ideas of things that we should consider, because they can feed into our plans for future webinars. So please don't feel this is entirely a one-way thing. We know we've got things we need to do based on what we're learning. So the first thing to consider is, when are you going to be doing things? And when I say when, I mean, are you going to be having sessions like this where everyone comes together at the same time? Are you going to be doing things at different times? So you're giving people some things to do and then they come back with some responses, not necessarily all at the same time, or you're going to do a mixture of both. So if you think, just to give you some examples, if you think your typical online meeting or an online workshop that like this but more two-way, that would be the at the same time example. And that's great if everyone is in the same time zone, if everyone has the same time commitment and same availability, then those sorts of sessions can work really well. At different times, an example would be if you were maybe putting a video up and then having a discussion forum to discuss what was going on in that video, or even just using comments in against a YouTube video to discuss what was happening. And I'll give you an example of that. I use a website called Manager Tools quite a bit. I have done for many years now. They produce a podcast every week, a 20-minute podcast on one aspect of management, completely free, really practical, very useful. And alongside the podcast, they have comments, so you can comment on that specific podcast, but they also have forums where you can go and ask questions of the team or of each other, your colleagues, and they have thousands of people in those forums. So that's another way you can manage the online training. You don't have to be all in the same place at the same time. There are benefits and disadvantages to both. And so that's when you might want to combine the two. And so that you might have some stuff that you give out for people to download or watch beforehand, then you have a meeting to work things out, and maybe some assignments or some questions or things that you do after that are not at the same time. So much depends on your audience, much depends on where they are in terms of time zone, much depends on their availability. But one of the key benefits for me of online training is that you can do this not necessarily all at the same time. It makes things much more flexible, and particularly at these times where people are trying to juggle childcare and all sorts of things like that, then trying to make things as flexible as possible, I think, is really important. So we also need to think about who we're dealing with, and are we dealing with anyone in the world? Are we making things open, or are we keeping it closed just to a small group? Now, sometimes that question will be answered because of who you're working for. And you might be a trainer within a large organization, and that's it, that's your audience. So you will be keeping it closed primarily, and you'll hopefully have systems and things that allow you to do that. And we'll talk about tools and systems in a moment. But if you're not, if you're a freelance trainer or working in a small company, you're trying to work with paying customers who are buying training from you, my recommendation is put as much as possible into the public domain. Make as much as possible open. It will keep your administration way more simpler. Because as soon as you close things down, you've got to think about security. You've got to think about how the process of getting people into your system, and it becomes complicated. The more you can put open, the better. Now, it also demonstrates that you're delivering value. That's one of the things with manager tools. Those podcasts that they delivered, and as I said, they've done this for many years now. They prove that they know what they're talking about. So much so that when they do have a conference, they charge £1,000 a day for a ticket, and they're always full, sold out, because people know that the value that they're going to get. So I would always tend to push towards the open as much as possible, and only keep the private stuff, the closed stuff, to the things that are absolutely necessary. And that's probably going to be the things where you need to interact personally with the people that you're training, things that you need to keep within the group, within the closed walls. So then the third question is, how are you going to do this? And I always ask three questions. And if you saw my LinkedIn post this morning, you would have seen a little grid that I put up. And I always think about these three questions. What are my learners going to be doing? What am I going to be doing? And what resources do I need? And it's important that you don't make your learners just sit and consume all the time, because that's a very passive way of learning. Now, that can work. We all sit and watch films very passively, and we sometimes learn things from them. But if we want to really train people, we need to be thinking, what are the active things that my learners are going to do? So it's not just listening to me or watching something. It's what are they going to do to interact, to engage with that piece of content, or how are they going to engage with me? And then what will I do as a trainer? So am I going to be presenting? Am I going to be asking questions? Am I going to be facilitating something? Am I going to be running an activity? And then think about what resources do you need? And the grid that I was talking about, I'm afraid I should have put a copy on here, but I didn't. I'll make sure it gets added to this. So you have these, what will your learners do? What will you do? What resources do you need, as the columns in your grid? And then down the left-hand side, you have rows, which are before a session and during a session and after a session. Now, a session can be whatever you, however you define it. It could be something that happens all at the same time. It could be something that's spread out over a few days. But what do you need to do, and what do you ask your learners to do before you start doing the learning activities? What are you going to do afterwards, and what are you going to do during? I'll share that grid with you later. I'll add it to this this presentation, just to make sure that it's clear. And then think about what feedback you're going to be getting and how you're going to be getting it. So, for example, you put a video up on YouTube and people can like it, and they can comment on it. Hopefully those comments will be constructive, and you get feedback ready for the next one. Or you could be asking different types of questions with open and closed questions, and you might do that in a forum setting or in a chat room setting, or on WhatsApp, or however you want to communicate. You can get people to send work to you as assignments or projects, or you can just track progress as they're working through materials. if you've got a system that allows you to track what people have done. All of these things are useful feedback. If you are working blind, it becomes very difficult, A for you as a trainer, and very difficult as a learner to really feel engaged with the person that's trying to train you. So try and find as many ways of getting feedback as you can, because it helps you know when you've made a difference. And then on things to consider, this is the last but one, what existing tools do you have? So we're talking today about how we can get started for free with no additional cost. So think about what you've already got available. Don't start looking for new tools, thinking, oh, I've got to have something that's special just for delivering training. You don't. If you're in an organization that has Office 365, you've got some fantastic tools built into it if you're training with people in that organization. Teams is great if you're doing video calls or just getting a group together to collaborate on documents. OneDrive is great if you've got some materials that you want to share with people. Yammer is a fantastic tool because as soon as you set up a group within Yammer, you've got a closed little group that you can communicate amongst each other with. It automatically sets up a SharePoint site for you. It automatically sets up a plan for you in Planner. You know, Yammer is just so nicely integrated within the rest of Office 365 and brilliant for managing learning experiences. And you've also got SharePoint, which is great for building just generic websites or lists of documents, all sorts of things you can add into SharePoint. So if you're using Office 365, you don't have to go out and buy anything else to run training. Similarly, if you're using the Google G Suite, you've got Hangouts for your meetings. They're starting to roll out a new tool called Meet, which does a similar thing. Drive for sharing and collaborating on documents. And if you've never collaborated on a document using the Google tools, then you've missed something, because it is a fantastic experience. Just building a PowerPoint or a Word document or a spreadsheet within it with other people, it's really quite mind-boggling. You've got sites if you want to build resource websites, and you've got groups if you want to set up email groups where you can you email into the group and the message goes out to everyone in that group. So some fantastic tools there. WhatsApp, hopefully you all know WhatsApp quite well. Great for one-to-one communication, but also for group messages, and you can do one-to-one video calls. LinkedIn, if you're on LinkedIn and your customers are on LinkedIn, then you could set up a LinkedIn group and keep that private and have discussions in there. So I've asked the question about others. I'm not expecting any initial feedback today, but if you've got other things that you would want to add to this list, then please put it in your feedback from the session. That would be useful. And then finally, in this section about things to consider, administration. So I mentioned earlier that if you keep things open, it reduces the administration, but sometimes you have to have some things closed, either for commercial reasons or privacy reasons or all sorts. And so you will need to think about the processes that you go through. How are you going to send out instructions to people on joining up with this group or with this course? How are you going to set up groups? How are you going to actually get the people's names and email addresses into the system that you're using? Are you going to send out login details? Do you need to send out login details? Because if they're already working in Office 365 or similar tools, you don't need to. But how are you going to make sure everyone is able to use the system? And then finally, how are you going to support them? How are you going to have a route for them to ask you questions, get technical support? It's not like just having them all in a room with you and they can ask questions, just one-to-one. You've got to think through the processes that you're going to use. Now, it doesn't have to be all in place right from day one. You will learn, you will make mistakes, and it will develop. But these are things that you will have to consider at some point in time. So the anything else is for things that you thought of and you want to add to the feedback, and we can add them into webinar sessions for the future. But at this point, I just wanted to stop and say, Sarah, Faye, Manjinder, are there any questions that I need to be looking at?
Hi, Mark. Sarah here. We've got a couple of questions here on tools, and I know we're running a separate webinar in a couple of weeks' time on tools, but maybe you could just address these two questions. First one is from Kirsty Hawkins. Does it matter if your delegates aren't using these tools? I.e., can they be invited and able to access?
Okay, so with these corporate tools like Office 365 and G Suite, a lot will depend on how your IT team have set it up. So, for example, SharePoint can be really open, or it can be very closed and no one else can use it. So you'll need to talk to your IT team about that. If you're in control of your own G Suite or Office 365 account, then you can make things as open or as closed as you wish. And what was the next question, Sarah?
So the next question is from Annalisa Mills, who asks, sorry, I'll do the next one from Susan Easton. She said, can you recommend any free or open source tools? Okay,
so I will be talking about tools in a little bit. Excuse me while I have a cough. Hang on. Sorry about that.
So well, if we leave that one for a bit,
yeah.
Then there is just the next question is from Annalisa, who asks, can you give advice about how to navigate copyright issues, e.g. if I want to embed a link to a video or website within the course materials? Do I need permission, or is it okay to include a link if you reference the source?
Right, so the general rule of thumb is that if you're putting a link to materials that are open on the web, then you're absolutely fine to put that link in. You don't need to credit anything because the link is the credit already. It's when you start actually putting someone else's materials into yours, that's when the copyright starts being an issue. So if you're embedding a YouTube video, then that's generally okay because people have put it on YouTube for it to be embedded. If you're providing a link to something, again, that's okay. But if you download that YouTube video or copy an image of Google Images and put that into your materials, then you must have permission for doing that. And people give permission lots of different ways. You either have to ask them directly for permission and get that in writing, or they will put a Creative Commons license on it and say, yes, anyone can use this. Or there are other licenses, but make sure you have permission to use this. I'm just going through a process at the moment with a client where we're discovering a lot of their images we don't have official permission for, and it's painful to retrofit that. It's much easier to do it as you go along, because if someone complains, you've got reputational damage, but also you've got potential financial issues if you don't abide by the copyright rules. So it's fine to embed a link, it's fine to embed a YouTube video, it's not fine to copy and paste someone's text or images or videos into your materials. I hope that answers your question, Annalisa. Any more questions, Sarah?
There's just one from Tony Pawsey with reference to your put it on YouTube. And he says, has there been any government guidance on vocational performance assessing? I think that might be a bit broad for this webinar.
Yeah, that's not one I can answer, I'm afraid. So we'll have to leave that for another time. But I'll just give you an example of an apprenticeship training scheme that I was working with a couple of years ago, where they were going to be using video cameras to record, for their apprentices to record their practice, and that was being assessed by the assessors remotely. So I'm not aware of there being government guidance about this. It's up to each endpoint assessment company that you're using, or whoever is doing the assessing, to work out best practice.
Okay, thanks, Mark. There's one final one, which is from Trying again, who asks, do firewalls cause problems?
Firewalls shouldn't cause problems if you've got access to the internet and, sorry, if you as a trainer and have got access to the internet and your systems are on the internet that you're using and your trainees are on the internet. Where it can cause problems is if you're dealing with countries like China, who have a firewall around the whole of China, and you might find that your systems that are on the internet can't actually get through their firewall. It's unusual for firewalls to cause a problem with sort of normal websites in a non-Chinese environment, non-lockdown environment. But there are always exceptions, and it tends to be less about the firewalls and more about internet filtering. And so some organizations have very, very strict internet filtering and only allow certain websites through, and that will cause problems. So whenever you're doing something new with a new group of people, try and test it beforehand before you're doing it for real. That's the only advice I can give. Right, so I'm going to move on, and we'll look at some of the expectations. Yeah, sorry, my title's gone. It should say common pitfalls at the top. I've lost the title. I'll get that fixed. So common pitfalls. These are all ones I've fallen into, and I'm sure there are others. So again, feel free to make comments in your feedback if you've got other examples that we could be adding to this. So when I say expectations of trainees, it's our expectations of trainees. So we expect them to try and do too much too quickly. And I've already talked about the teacher training example I gave. There are many others where we try and move them on way too quickly without giving them time to acclimatize to this new way of working. So don't expect too much too soon, but just have a gradual progression of things getting more complex, more sophisticated as you go on. Secondly, on the user experience, I mentioned earlier about administration, making sure you consider administration. That's all part of the user experience. Too often as trainers, we focus solely on the materials and forget about how we're going to get people to those materials or what we expect people to do with those materials. So think about the whole end-to-end user experience. Thirdly, expectations of yourself. So for many people, this is going to be a new, and for some people, a scary experience because this is a new environment. So I would say don't try and do too much too soon. Start with something that you feel relatively confident in. So if you're used to using WhatsApp or you're used to using Facebook and you're allowed to use Facebook for this purpose, then use it for your training. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be your final answer, but at least start by doing something in using a tool that you already know. And so don't try and do too much too soon. Don't get too sophisticated too quickly. It's very tempting when you're faced with a brand new tool that you have all the bells and whistles and you try and do everything. This is particularly true if you're using the sophisticated learning management tools like Moodle and places like that, and they generally come with everything switched on. And what I do whenever I get a Moodle site or another system like that, I turn most things off, because A, it's good for my learners because they're not faced with loads of stuff that they don't need to know about yet, but also it's good for the people, the trainers that I'm working with, because they don't need to know about it yet. I can always add things in at a later date as they become more confident. So try and keep things simple. And finally, the legal stuff. So we mentioned about copyright already, but there's GDPR is a big issue. Is as soon as you start collecting data about people, and personal data especially, you will need to be compliant with GDPR. And this session is not going to talk about GDPR in any detail at all, and there are other people that can talk about it way more knowledgeably than I can, and there's lots of useful advice out there, but be aware of it. As soon as you start collecting data, you need to be aware that you need to make sure you're compliant with GDPR. You need to know why you're collecting it. You need to know where it's going to be. You need to know who's going to have access to it. And if you can cover those bases and you've got good answers for all of those, then you should be fine. But be very aware of the rules that you're under. Also think about accessibility. Can my audience access the materials, the activities I'm putting out? We had a question last week about getting transcripts for this session, and because this was done in quite a rush, it's something we hadn't considered last week. We're looking into how we can get transcripts ready for when we put this up online with closed captions or something like that. If you're using a tool like Zoom, that has transcripts already built in. So it will automatically, any recording that you do in Zoom, you can ask for it to be automatically transcribed, and that transcript will be then available for you to use with your customers, with your trainees. So think about accessibility. And it's not just about hearing and seeing, it's also about motor skills. So if you're giving someone an activity that's got drag and drop activities in, or a simulation that you're working with, make sure they've got the motor skills to take advantage of that, or give them an alternative. And then finally, on the legal stuff, it's safeguarding. So if you're working with vulnerable people or children, you must be aware of the safeguarding rules that you're under. And hopefully you'll be doing this as part of an organization that already has safeguarding policies. When you're working online, you're still under the same rules. So general advice, if you're working with children and vulnerable adults, don't use tools like Facebook to do the communicating. Get tools that are designed for it and are monitored, and it keeps you safe, it keeps them safe. So just be really careful. So all the same stuff that you would be under legally when you're working face-to-face, you are still under when you're working online, and if not more so. So you just need to be really careful. Just checking my notes from last week, see if there's anything. Yes, so the pitfall that we met last week, we had a lot of people with audio problems at the beginning, and two things we did this week to try and mitigate that was we started 15 minutes early to give people a chance to get their audio settings worked out, but we also put the advice on the side, at the first slide, please check your audio settings. There's nothing that can destroy a live session like this more quickly than a whole heap of technical issues that eat into the first 15-20 minutes of it. And the more people you have in it, the more problems that's going to make. And yeah, and be careful with your audio, with the tools that you're using, particularly if you're doing live meetings, you are setting yourself up for all sorts of fun times. So many of us will have seen the video from last year, and the professor was interviewed on the BBC, and his child walked in and started calling out while he was being interviewed live on the news. And we've probably seen lots of examples this week of similar sorts of things happen. There was one example where people were in a live online meeting with video, and one of the participants forgot to turn her camera off and took her phone with her into the toilet. And you can imagine the reactions. So just be very careful, know your tools, know how to get the best out of them, and know what to be careful with. So just see if there are any more questions. Sarah, has anything else come in?
Yes, we've got a couple of questions here. Firstly, there's one on tools, which I believe you're going to cover in the next section. So we'll leave Rosita's questions about a recommended learning management system. There's one from John Brindley who asks, do you find it necessary to have base learning levels for course candidates?
Okay, John, I'm assuming you're talking about literacy levels and IT literacy. Obviously, that the more literate someone is, the more digitally confident they are, the easier it will be for them to access online training. But that doesn't mean that it's essential. So you think about how many people use Facebook, use WhatsApp, that don't necessarily have huge literacy or digital literacy capabilities, but they can still use those tools. So if it's a matter of matching the way you're going to work with your audience, with the people you're training. So if you're working with people who do have low base learning levels, then set your expectations appropriately and choose the tools that you're going to use appropriately. Again, that's pretty much the only advice I can give at the moment in this sort of generic context. I'm obviously happy to talk at another time if you want any sort of specific advice. Sarah, what's the next one?
Okay, the next one is a question from Alison, which I think, again, you need to cover it off in tools, which is about software that can provide subtitles. But this one from Joe, I think, is interesting. He's saying, can you repeat the issue with Facebook for working with young people?
Okay, so I used to be a teacher many moons ago, and thankfully I was teaching in the time before Facebook, because these days as a teacher you have to be so careful when you're working with people on Facebook, because you're not allowed to be actually connected to any of your pupils on Facebook. You're not allowed to be a friend with them. And it's all about protecting yourself as a teacher, but also protecting them, because Facebook is an uncontrolled environment. So it's just about being careful. It's better to use an environment that your organization has set up specifically for your customers, that works in a way that everyone understands, everyone knows how the privacy settings work, whereas Facebook, it can be so open and so not dodgy, but you just have to be careful. I hope that answers your question, Joe.
Then thanks, Mark. We've got a couple of questions about learning design. The first one is, do you find having no video a lot easier, or is it more effective to have a mix of video and slides?
So normally when I'm running a meeting, I try to have video, and I try to have everyone on video, because having that visual feedback is invaluable. Obviously that's not always possible. When we've got 170 people in here now, it would be impossible to have you all on video, and the reason my video is switched off is to help you, some of the people that here are from places with low bandwidth, and it's just to help things along a bit there. Normally when I'm working with people globally, I'd start with video and then we switch video off later on, just to ease up on the bandwidth restrictions. But if you can use video, I would use it. When you mentioned about having slides are great in an event like this, where it is very much presentation. It's mostly one way. So you expect slides, you expect to be able to use the slides to give something as a visual cue for what's going on. Slides can be also very useful if you're working with people who don't speak English or your language as their first language. But don't just rely on slides. Sometimes the best meetings, the best training events don't have any slides at all, and they use whiteboards, they use other tools to help collaborate on documents. You don't necessarily have to have slides. So sorry, that's a very waffly answer, Liz, but it was just trying to say it depends, really.
And finally, there's a question from Abdusiriak Mohammed, who's really asking about engagement. He's put in two questions. They said, we're doing ESOL classes remotely with our learners. We're doing conference video. Do you have any ideas on keeping the audience interested and keen on learning remotely? And what advice could you give on engagement, please?
Okay, so I'm going to dodge that question because you've got someone coming up in is it 2 weeks' time when we talk about video meetings? Is that
no,
right?
it's next week.
This Thursday coming or Thursday after?
This Thursday coming, and then the following Tuesday a repeat.
Okay.
I'll send you a link to all of the different webinars that we're running in this series at the end of this one.
Yeah. So the one this Thursday is all about virtual meetings and virtual events like this and how to run them best. So I'm going to defer that question to that webinar, and if you can't get to the webinar, then you'll be able to get the recording at a later date. Sorry if that doesn't answer your immediate question, but you'll be able to get it answered on Thursday. So on to tools. Now, I've put together in the last week or so a list of currently 65 completely free tools that are useful for trainers. And you can get to it on this link at the bottom here. If you when you get the link to these slides, you'll be able to flick through the slides and actually get to this link directly. And it's covering a whole range of different types of tools: audio, video, whiteboards, communication and collaboration tools, forums, photos, all sorts. So there's 65, that's only going to grow. And if you've got any examples of other tools that you would expect to see added to this list, please let me know. Some of these are completely free and open source. So open source means that you can take the code and do with it what you want. Some of them are operate a freemium model, so you'll get a limited set of functionality for free, and then if you want more, then you pay for it. So for example, there are quite a few tools in here that are around whiteboarding, and some of them will give you 3 whiteboards for free. Some of them will allow you to share it with up to 5 people, and they'll limit things. So you just need to work out which one's going to be the best one for you. And I've tried to give a number of options in each category. You can sort it by categories. If you just click on the sort button, you can search if you want to, so I can find anything to do with whiteboards, and that's all my whiteboard things. So I've tried to make this as immediately useful as possible. It's available. This is available for free, and as I say, if you've got other examples that you'd like, then please suggest them. Now, all of this comes with a health warning. Software takes time and effort to create. So some people are really kind and they'll create a piece of software and they'll distribute it for free, and that's great. What they might not then do is support it and maintain it and keep it secure and all those good things. It needs to happen in software. It needs to have ongoing development because they're not getting paid for it. So you must be aware of the business case that is sitting behind or the business model that's sitting behind any software that you use, especially if it's software that you rely on. So I would be very wary of setting up a whole business run on free software, because you never know if that software is going to continue to be maintained or secured or just kept up to date with everyone else's software. I would always be looking for what's the business model that's behind this. So for example, Moodle, yes, you can download it for free, you can use it for free, you don't have to contribute to it at all. But Moodle also, as an organization, has a very secure and robust business model that sits behind it. And I trust that, and I know it's going to keep going. So just be careful when you're looking at tools. If it's something you're just trying out with a group, it's a one-off, or you're just testing things, great, go for it. Try as many as you can. Work out what works for you, and then find one that you can stick with and probably support financially in some way. But also look at the tools that you've got already. So if you're working on a Mac, for example, so I'll just bring up all the ones that are Mac OS. So if you're working on a Mac, you've got GarageBand and Keynote built in already. You don't have to buy any presentation tools. You don't have to buy any audio tools. You've also got iMovie for creating videos. It's all built in. And that comes from Apple, and we know they're pretty secure financially. There are similar tools for Windows, although a lot of those you have to pay for. But check out if you're not using Microsoft Office, check out LibreOffice, because that has all the Office tools for word processing, spreadsheets, drawings, PowerPoints, and yeah, that's it. So all that, and sometimes it's actually a lot easier to use than the Microsoft version. I tend to use LibreOffice as much as I can. So I would advise find the tools that you have first of all that are built into your system or are freely available from your system provider, or find the tools that you've got in your organization, and then start looking around for other tools. Now, someone asked about learning management systems and Moodle and things like that earlier. So they are great. They are usually very sophisticated, very functional. I've used Moodle for years since it first came out, and I love it. I know it really well. I can make it sing. If you're starting out from scratch with Moodle, you need to expect a very steep learning curve. You'll need someone. It's easy to set up a course in Moodle, but you probably need someone who can help you set up the administrative bits that sit outside the course. You don't need coding abilities or anything like that. Don't be misled by a lot of people that say, oh, you need to be able to code to use Moodle. It's not true, but you do need to be able to understand how the software works. So be prepared to spend time with it. But it's true, that's true with a lot of software. If you start video editing or audio editing, be prepared to spend time with the software to get used to how the tools work. So I'm just going to see if there are any more questions, because that usually generates quite a few. Anything there, Sarah?
Well, we have the question from Alison about accessibility for disabled learners. So what can be done to improve that, such as software that provides subtitles? Yeah,
so if you're using PowerPoint, for example, and you're on an Office 365 subscription, that comes with, and it's really clever, it comes with the ability to put subtitles on, and it will listen to you as you're presenting and automatically add the subtitles as you're talking. It won't always be entirely accurate, but it's really, really neat. So that's one way you can do it. And I think it can even translate as you're talking. I'm sure I've seen someone doing that as well. So that's one way. If you're creating YouTube videos and putting them online and wanting them to get captioned, I'm pretty sure, I can't say for definite, but I'm pretty sure YouTube has an ability to add automatic closed captions. You will need to check it and make sure, check how accurate it is. But there are also third-party tools where you can upload your audio track and get them to put the subtitles in. So there's a process you would have to go through from creating your video or creating your materials and then getting a subtitle made. There are free tools for creating those sorts of transcripts, but they are also generally these freemium type tools. So they'll allow maybe a 5-minute video or a 5-minute audio track, something like that. So I hope that helps us.
Thanks, Mark. We've got one more question here. It's from Abiola, and Abiola's asking, what is the difference between a webinar and online video conference?
Not much, really. They're just different names for different types of thing using the same tool. For example, you could say, what's the difference between an encyclopedia and a novel? They're both books, so they're both using the same tool, but they have a different purpose. So a webinar is generally an educational thing where you've got someone who's speaking with some knowledge and other people are listening and hopefully participating. An online meeting is generally much more interactive and collaborative. So I hope that helps. And there was a question last week which someone said, are there any good guides for learning Moodle? And I would point you first of all to the Moodle documents website. That's it. And then from there you can head out. Now I know I've run over time. It's 4 o'clock now, isn't it? So my apologies. We've been rattling on. So I'm just very quickly going to show you what's on the rest of the slides. There are only 2 more. So these are some very useful materials that you can get to. These blue things are links. You can click on those when you get to the presentation. The only one you pay for is the instruction manual at the end. The other 3 are completely free. And final conclusions, you've already heard this before. Use the tools you've got already. Focus on the activities, not just on learners consuming stuff. Take your time. It won't be perfect first time. This is a learning curve for a lot of people. So just learn and iterate. Just keep changing things, testing it out, and ask for help. And I'm available on LinkedIn if anyone's got any questions. Just search for me, connect up with me. I'm very happy to help in any way I can. And I shall leave it there. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And Sarah, do you want to quickly say what's happening next week, in the next 2 weeks?
Okay, in the next 2 weeks, we'll be running further webinars on the basics of learning design, so how to design for your online learners, and that will be with Dan Whiston, and that will be running twice, once on a Thursday and then on the following Tuesday. And then the next week, we have Patrick Dunn, who is talking about how to choose online tools. So whereas Mark has provided us with a wonderful list, but it's about how do you make the decision on what you actually need, what questions do you need to ask. And we will email the link to all of those when we email you the presentation, and all of the links to all of the webinars will also be available on the UFI website. We're going to ask you some feedback at the end of this webinar because this is a new venture for us and we really want to hear from you. So if you have other topics that you would like us to cover, then please do let us know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much, and I'm going to close things off now.
Goodbye.
Bye.